Physiological response to a tap dance choreography, comparison with graded exercise tests and prescription recommendations. College of Physical Education, Catholic University of Brasilia, UCB, Brasilia, DF, Brazil. Graduate Program on Physical Education and Health, Catholic University of Brasilia, Brasilia, DF, Brazil, and College of Physical Education, Federal University of Val Sol, Francisco, Petrolina, PE, Brazil. Introduction. Physical fitness of professional dancers is as important as their specific skills development. It has been suggested that dancing can be used as an attractive type of exercise because of its potential effects on aerobic fitness for both health and performance. Besides the promotion of happiness and social integration among the participants, the tap dance is known as the dance percussion among the dance modalities because it produces songs with the body, especially with the foot. It is well accepted that for cardiorespiratory fitness and health-related benefits, the physical activities should be performed around 70 to 85% of the maximum heart rate, HRmax, or between 50 and 85% of VO2max. The lactate threshold, LT, intensity has been pointed out as an effective intensity for fitness improvements. However, few studies were designed to evaluate the acute physiological response of dancing and compare them to well-established parameters such as LT and VO2max. Cohen et al. Reported that in exercise performance during classic ballet classes, subjects achieved a VO2 of 20.1 milliliters per kg per minute, 46% of VO2 max, and 158 beats per minute of mean HR, around 85% of HR max. Of note, these responses are comparable to those observed for exercise performed at LT intensity. In fact, several studies have examined the physiological responses to dance modalities such as modern dance, ballet, and aerobic dance. However, according to our in-depth literature review, no previous studies investigated the energetic expenditure and metabolic responses in tap dancers, neither using a graded exercise test, GXT, nor during a specific tap dance choreography, TAP. It is important to characterize the physiological responses to a tap dance session because of the modality has been broadly practiced. Such characterization will turn possibly to verify if the physiological demand is enough to promote fitness improvements and will enable the design of a more specific training program for professional dancers. The objectives of the present study were to A. Characterize the physiological response to a tap, to compare these physiological responses with those observed during a GXT, and to analyze if the physiological response to a tap dance would reach the current recommendations in the literature for health-related benefits, based on previous studies involving other dance modalities, and on the practical experience with the tap dance. We hypothesized that the tap choreography would elicit a physiologic demand similar to intensities recommended for health-related improvements. Methods. Experimental approach to the problem. To examine the physiological response to a tap and to verify if such responses are sufficient to reach recommendations of intensity for a health-related benefit, 2 experimental sessions were conducted, separated by 48 hours, at the local exercise physiology laboratory. Both sessions were conducted at the time of day between 9 and 10 a.m. to avoid bias from circadian rhythm. In the first visit to the laboratory, volunteers underwent GXT with the purpose of identifying maximum oxygen uptake and LT. For the second visit, participants performed a traditional American tap. During both experimental sessions, ventilatory, metabolic, cardiovascular, and perception variables were measured, which were selected based on its wide use for physical activity intensity control. Subjects were instructed to avoid vigorous exercise 24 hours before each test. Subjects were 8 women, middle to advanced level tap dancers with at least 6 months of experience in the choreography performed. 19.6 plus or minus 2.4 years, 162.3 plus or minus 4.4 centimeters, 54 point not plus or minus 2.3 kilograms, 20.5 plus or minus 1.4 kilograms per meter squared, and 5.1 plus or minus 2.6 years of tap dance experience. Volunteers trained 3 hours a week and often had public presentations with the main presentation 6 months apart. Of note, none of the volunteers were professional dancers. That is, performed the dance just as a hobby. All the subjects filled out amnesic formed and underwent resting electrocardiograph ECG evaluation under physician supervision. After a verbal communication covering the objectives, procedures involved, and the possible risks and benefits of the study protocol, written informed consent was obtained from each participant before the investigation. The study design and procedures were approved by the university's Human Ethics Committee under the protocol CEP-UCB number 101-207. Graded exercise test. All participants were submitted to a treadmill super ATL Ibramid Litid Porta Alegre RS Brazil graded exercise test under physician supervision. The protocol consisted of an individualized initial speed corresponding to 10, very light, too light, on the 15-point Borg perceived exertion scale. The initial speed ranged from 5.5 to 7 kilometers per hour, and the increments were 0.8 kilometers an hour at each 3 minutes until volitional exhaustion. Before testing, subjects were prepared for 3-lead ECG digital micromed Brazil, and had basic instructions related to the procedures and to use of the Borg perceived exertion scale. The laboratory had a temperature-controlled environment and all the equipment and medications needed to provide emergency care. Choreography tap dance test. The choreography adopted was created by Leonard Reed, Mrs. Sham, in 1927 and has been widely used by the American tap dancers. The testing protocol consisting of 9 3-minute stages with 1 minute rest between stages. Such a protocol intended to emulate a typical dance training session. Measurements. Expired gases were continuously measured breath by breath for oxygen uptake VO2 and carbon dioxide output VCO2 using the Cortex Metalizer 3B apparatus, Cortex Biophysics, Leipzig, Germany, on both experimental visits to the laboratory. Respiratory exchange rate, RER, and metabolic equivalent were calculated. Also, HR was measured using a polar F4 Kempel, Finland. Capillary blood samples, 25, were obtained from the earlobe and deposited into 1.5 milliliter microtubes containing 50 of NAF at 1% concentration for the subsequent blood lactate analysis. YSI 2700 Stat, Yellow Springs Instrument, Yellow Springs, Ohio, USA. Blood samples were obtained at rest at each 1 minute interval between stages for both GXT and TAP, and throughout the recovery period. The Borg scale rate of perceived oxygen exertion, RPE, was systematically recorded during both experimental sessions. The instruments were carefully calibrated according to the manufacturer's specifications before every testing session. Statistical analysis. Variables were exposed as mean plus or minus SD. Repeated measures, analysis of variance, ANOVA, was performed when comparing variables among maximal, submaximal, both for GXT and TAP. Bonferroni test for parametric data and Dunn multiple comparisons. Friedman test for non-parametric data were used to identify possible differences. The significance level was set at p is less than 0.05. And all analysis were performed using the GraphPad Prism version 3.0 software. Results. Table 1 shows maximal cardiorespiratory, metabolic, and perceived exertion variables obtained at the end of the GXT. Variables of the LT intensity identified on the treadmill during GXT are presented in the Table 2. Table 3 shows the results from the TAP session. Figure 1 depicts physiological and perceived exertion variables, comparisons between maximal effort and LT, both obtained at the GXT, with those observed at the TAP session. It can be observed that all evaluated variables were significantly higher at the exhaustion moment of the GXT when compared to the LT intensity and to TAP sessions. Except for RER and blood lactate concentrations, all the remaining variables were not significantly different when comparing LT intensities to TAP sessions. Discussion. The main findings of the present study were that the TAP, the Shim, with 27 minutes of duration performed by middle and high-level TAP dancers showed similar physiologic responses when compared to aerobic exercise prescription recommendations, 83.8 plus or minus 6.2% HRmax, 93.0 plus or minus 10.8 HRLT, 68.9 plus or minus 11.3% VO2 max, and 88.2 plus or minus 15.7% VO2 LT, Table 3. Thus, presenting the potential of this modality to dance to promote cardiovascular improvements. Moreover, it was possible to identify that HR, VO2, and RPE responses to the tap were similar to those observed at the LT intensity. Taken together, these observations support the study hypothesis suggesting that the tap dance provides an adequate stimulus for promoting cardiovascular and metabolic improvements similar to those from the exercise performance around the LT intensity. When comparing LAC and RER results, the TAP session elicited lower values than those results from LT, figure 1, which can be explained by the fact that the TAP exercise intensity was around 10% less than that of the LT, table 3. In that sense, the present results suggest that there were larger anaerobic glycolytic contributions at the LT intensity. A possible explanation for this augmented glycolytic activity can be because of more motor unit recruitment and also more muscle mass used during the running exercise, increasing production more than did TAP. Consistent with this assumption, RER values were much lower during the TAP. TAP equals 0.88 plus or minus 0.995 versus LT equals 0.96 plus or minus 0.06. P is less than 0.05, figure 1. Based on the RER values during the TAP, energy expenditure was 60.8% from carbohydrates, CHO, and 39.2% from fat. During the LT intensity, the CHO contribution was 87.2%, whereas the fat contribution was 12.8%. These results provide evidence that TAP induces important fat use of energetic substrate, suggesting that this type of exercise can be prescribed for body fat control and for controlling lipemia. Despite tap dance being broadly practiced by young and elderly populations, its acute physiological responses have been poorly investigated. To our knowledge, this is the first study to describe the metabolic, cardiorespiratory, and perceived exertion responses during the tap, comparing those responses with LT and VO2max exercise intensities from the typical type of exercise, running. One et al. Studied that cardiovascular and ventilatory responses in ballet dancers of different technical levels and found oxygen consumption of 18.3 milliliters per kg per minute and HR of 111 beats per minute for high-level dancers and 16.8 milliliters per kg per minute and 118 beats per minute for the lower-level dancers. The result found that the type of dancers in the study in tap dancers, 28.2 plus or minus 4.6 milliliters per kg per minute of VO2 and 170 plus 0.9 plus or minus 14.8 beats per minute of HR were higher than that found by one et al., probably because of the faster pace in the dance used in this study. In the recent report, 32 modern ballet dancers, 5 men and 27 women, achieved 56.6 plus or minus 9.3 milliliters per kg per minute of VO2 max during a GXT after 3 months of aerobic and strength exercise training, suggesting that aerobic training program may benefit the dance performance. The tap dancers in the present study who did not have any additional training reached 41.3 plus or minus 5.2 milliliters per kg per minute of VO2 max. That's about 27% lower than one study results. The mean relative intensity, 83.8 plus or minus 6.2 HRmax during the 27 minutes of tap was higher than 60 minutes of body pump, body combat step, and spinning, 60.2 plus or minus 6.5, 73.2 plus or minus 7.3, and 72.4 plus or minus 5.7, and 74.3 plus or minus 6.7% of HR max, respectively, as Rickson et al. Study. In the present study, HR and LAC results from the TAP were 170.9 plus or minus 14.8 beats per minute and 1.7 plus or minus 0.4 millimoles per liter of lactic acid, I think. In other studies, the contemporary ballet dancers, the HR reported, was between 155 plus or minus 12.9 and 190 plus or minus 3.1 beats per minute, and the LAC reported between 1.5 plus or minus 0.7 and 3.4 plus or minus 1.1 millimoles per liter. These results were similar to our own, but based on the LAC results, there was less metabolic stress during the tap dance. The disagreement among the LAC results in all those different studies can be because of the different motor requirements when comparing the tap dance with other kinds of dances. The physiological response during the tap are in agreement with the American College of Sports Medicine recommendations for exercise prescription aiming for aerobic fitness improvement. These recommendations are for exercise performance of continuous and interval exercise between 50 and 85% of VO2 max, or 64 and 94% of the HRmax, 3 to 5 times a week, and 20 to 60 minutes of duration. The mean energy expended during the tap was 8.1 plus or minus 1.3 met, which was higher than the 4.5 met expended during the 1 kilometer of a walk-in for 12 minutes, or 6.5 met of 1 kilometer walk-in for 9 minutes and 23 seconds, but lower than the 16 kilometers an hour of running for 3 minutes and 45 seconds. We demonstrated that the relative values of VO2 max and HRmax and VO2 HR and MET during the tap were an acute metabolic requirement level, high enough to improve physical fitness related to the individual health. Thus, it can be used as an option to daily physical activity substitution or contemplation. Also, this activity is considered to be enjoyable because dance, peace, and music are important events to stimulate motivation and adherence. However, it should be considered that the present sample was composed of middle and advanced level dancers, so the precise physiological characterization of the general population needs to be performed in future investigations. We concluded that the Shim, Sham, Shimmy tap performance reached acute physiological responses similar to activities performed around the LT, thus suggesting its use for the aerobic fitness and health improvements purposes. More studies are needed to examine the chronic effects of the tap and to examine the acute effects in a sample of novice dancers. Practical applications. Once the physiological demand of the tap dance is similar to the literature recommendations for exercise prescription, we suggest that this dance modality can be considered an option for physical activity that can be included in exercise training programs aiming to improvement of aerobic fitness levels. As a practical suggestion, the prescription of a tap dance program would be conducted in a frequency ranging from 2 to 4 sessions per week, each session lasting between 60 and 90 minutes, and intensities between 70 and 85% FC mass. Also, the RPE can be used alternatively for controlling the intensity. In that sense, it is suggested a rate of perceived exertion ranging from 11 to 15 on the 15-point Borg scale. A session of tap dance is generally composed of 3 different phases as follows: the initial phase, or warm-up, 20 to 30 minutes, the main phase, 30 to 40 minutes, and cool-down period, 10 to 20 minutes. In the warm-up, one can use fast movements aiming at loosening the body and the weight transfer. Such movements can include shuffles, double shuffles, flaps, triples, and time steps. The main part should be developed based on the specific purposes of the trainer and will determine the training routes, choreographies. In this main part, more complex steps such as the pullbacks, winks, cramps, drawbacks, toe points are suggested. The cool-down period can be composed of diagonal movements, spins, and slower steps. Therefore, the tap dance seems attractive, for example, for people who want to substitute or complement their daily physical activities in this exercise modality. It should be pointed out, however, that the present sample was composed of middle to advanced level dancers, so their precise physiological characteristics in novices needs to be performed in future investigations. Acknowledgements. The authors are grateful to National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, CNPQ, for the financial support.